This is my first time being in Wilmington, and it is my first time being at the camp. And it is unbelievable. As I was walking through, I said, wow, I gotta catch my breath, because I am here with quilters that I have admired for a very long time, but I've never seen their work actually in person. Carolyn Meslumi, the G's Bins, and it really does touch my heart, because I can see elements in my quilts that I am using just like they're using. And it's probably because I've been seeing their work for so long. And it's just amazing to me. So thank you so very much. And also I want to thank you for having this wonderful weather. Just I'm loving it. I made the mistake of lying out on the beach today. And I'm like, this is gonna have to stop, because I have to focus on what I'm gonna say to you. But I am Beverly Smith. I'm a mixed media fiber artist. And I love quilts because of the connection they have to my ancestors and Southern roots. And my grandmother, who lived in Blacksburg, South Carolina, that's my first encounter with quilts. And I was the kind of child that never really liked to be away from home. But I would go to my grandmother's house in Blacksburg, and she would put me in this little room right off the kitchen and put that heavy patchwork quilt on top of me, and I just felt totally secure. So it wasn't until I was in college that I started exploring textiles, and I just naturally came back to quilts. And my first quilt in college, it was a mess. But my instructor saw something, and they entered me into a contest for all North Carolinian colleges and universities. And I came away with first place. And I was like, okay, this is cool. I can tell my story and embrace my grandmother's love for quilts at the same time. So I will start telling you a little bit, I guess, about this quilt right here. And it is titled Plant a Seed. And up here I have the top of it that says, if you think in terms of 1 year, plant a seed. And in terms of 100 years, teach everyone. Confucius said something of this nature, but being a lifelong educator, I still know the importance that education for girls, how important that is, that we have equity in our education as well. I grew up with 4 sisters. This is me in the center. Just to keep us up right with. And my parents did not have a formal education, but I remember them working several jobs to make sure that we had the opportunity to go to college. And I still value it to this day. I taught about 35 years, and now I just do my art. There are some commonalities you're gonna see in my artwork as I talk. And a lot of it has to do with red shoes. I do a lot of research. A lot of my stories come from family talk, sitting around at the foot of my parents, my great aunts, and hearing them talk. And I recall information that way, but I also do a lot of research. I have cousins that are very particular about having specific information and dates. And so I go to courthouses a lot and go back to the old towns where my family grew up, and I do a lot of research. And I found, welcome. And I found my grandmother Cassie, that was born in 1789. I found a ledger, a store ledger, the McGill store, and she was purchasing a pair of red shoes. And that, yeah, okay, and I'm thinking, that granny 1835, when you think of most African Americans at that time may have been enslaved. And I'm like, wow, my granny had a little bit of sass in her. And so I put these shoes on all of my characters to give them that Cassie But also, it amazed me. She was shopping for a lot of different fabrics and tobacco, but she also purchased a little red dye called Madder. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it was only a small ounce. I'm like, she can't dye with that amount. So I figured she probably was using it for makeup and lipstick. I'm still amazed at that. But a lot of my stories go all the way back to my ancestors and telling their stories and sharing them all over again. So Plant a Seed is one of those stories that talks about my sisters and the importance of education for me. And then when we come to this quilt, which is based on a series of works I've been doing that have to do with African Americans after the Civil War, after they were freed. They were putting out these ads with looking for their relatives. And I never really understood that pain, that separation caused by slavery, emancipation, and the war, families being separated at that time, until I started researching some of my relatives that were on the Blaylock plantation. Jeremiah Blaylock owned generations of my family, and in his will, I can see all of their names and where all of the children and some of the older adults went as well. Many of them were placed on the auction block, others went to his children. These three girls, two of them are twins, and my great-grandmother that was on the plantation, Mariah, she had a twin. I never knew that. My family was not able to share that with me because they're so old, but my research revealed that. She had a twin sister, Mariah, and they were separated on the plantation at about the age of 5. And when I'm reading these things, I have all these high emotions. It takes me a while to digest. Sometimes I have to put a quilt aside and then come back. But while I was researching and going through those feelings of being separated from someone, I felt my ancestors being separated, but I also didn't realize that a sister of mine, and I don't have her quilt here, but I made a quilt of her as well because she has a name that goes back to the 1800s. But I didn't realize I was still dealing with the separation of my own sister who took her life on my birthday. It's been almost 20 years now, Evangeline. And so that's when I realized, oh my gosh, my quilts, it's a real healing process for me. And so I do really love going through the process. So these three girls, they are going on the auction block, and the letters and the advertisements that were sent out looking for relatives, I love these flour sacks. I incorporate those into my work. That's another commonality you'll see in my quilts. I collect vintage, authentic flour sacks. My mother in the 40s grew up in the Great Depression in Barnwell, South Carolina, and she told me how they would wear flour sacks. And then they had the logos on them, but they would use lye to try to scrape out the logos. And then when the flour companies found out that the families were really wearing these as dresses and garments, they began to add floral patterns in them. And 5 sacks usually would make an average girl-sized dress. So whenever people went to the mill to pick up flowers, the flour company knew they would get 5 sacks, and and they would have these wonderful designs on them. But also, I started, in my process, I started using indigo dye because my research also showed me how my ancestors, before cotton was king, they made a lot of money using indigo dye. And they used to dye indigo in Charleston, but also in Africa. It was a talent that they had. So I started dyeing my ticking fabric. And most of you know of ticking fabric like mattresses or used for bed pillows because it's a tightly woven fabric and it keeps straw from coming out of it. And also, I use it symbolically to kind of show the connection to my ancestors. I started with this graphite drawing. I love the black and white portraits in my family's photo albums. Those are the only portraits I use, and I found that like some people refer to a lot of color as visual noise, but black and white takes away that visual noise, and you can actually focus on the actual person and their character. So I started doing graphite and black and white when I was in graduate school. I had to fulfill an advanced drawing class, and one was not available. So they placed me in an advanced MFA painting class. And all the students got yards and yards of canvas. And I received the canvas as well. And I'm like, okay, what am I gonna do with this and fulfill my drawing? And so that's when I started rendering on the canvas. And it's also when I started experimenting with painting on my quilts. But I also love collecting vintage fabrics. And like the monkey wrench that you see here, it is like a 1930s quilt. People donate them to me. I do a lot of attic sales, yard sales, flea markets. That's my life. And but I also love how they talk about secret codes hidden in quilts. And during the Underground Railroad, it was said that slaves would sew symbols into their quilts to help those that were escaping to the north. And they would just hang them out, but not everyone knew the symbols and what they meant. Quilt historians will tell you that they don't have enough information to say that really took place. But I know Tubin, the historian that wrote Hidden in Plain View, he interviewed descendants of slaves that told them how they would use this in the quilts. But the monkey wrench would be a clue, like there are materials that you can go to a certain blacksmith if you're traveling by wagon, and they would help you get the tools that you would need. And also the drunkard's path that you see here. This is also like a 1920s, but its secret code would say, okay, they're on your trail. They're on your tracks. You're gonna have to meander, go a different route so that they will not be able to follow you. So sometimes that drunkard's path would take you right back to the plantation or to the south. And the people looking and the catchers, they would not suspect that you'd go back to that direction. They're looking for you to go to the north, and that would throw them off. And people always talk about, look how large your feet are. The feet are very poignant because of the traveling that takes place and the movement and all. I wanted to like emphasize that. But also the writing that I have back here with the dye of the indigo, the fading in and out of the letters. I do a lot of graveyard rubbings. I get a lot of information from tombstones. And I make my own wax so I can get the information off. Some of the tombstones are so old I can't read anything unless I am doing the crayon over the tombstone. But I know of many of my family's grave sites. I researched, I found out where the grave sites are. A lot of them stay in the same town and the grave sites are there as well. So it's just talking about information wanted on my daughters. That's how a lot of the ads came out. But Villanova graduate students, they collected at least 900 of these ads that went out. And they went out all over the place. You can find them in Canada. The bulk of them are in South Carolina, but you can find them in Ireland, you can find them in Spain. People looking for their relatives after the war and after they were freed from slavery. And I was working in my studio, and these names started coming to me. I had already started collecting them because of Jeremiah Blaylock's will, but they started calling out their names. And I started creating quilts as quickly as I could. But the names have been coming so quickly that I started combining images so I can get as many names out as I can. I have a quilt in my studio now with about 5 individuals on them, but the names still have not stopped. And I am eager, people, to start another project. I'm looking at doing these sculptures. So I'm hoping that the names will slow down. Now, when this quilt here, it is not part of my series, Lasting Wearing, but my sister Carolyn, she was supposed to visit with me today. She does a lot of modeling for me. My sisters, my nieces, my nephews, if I'm not getting them from the photographs. So these are like real faces of my ancestors. But the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. People growing up in the South know that, especially if you've ever picked blackberries. And my conversation with some of the ladies is like, there's nothing like picking a blackberry off the vine. I just did. And they have a special taste. You cannot get it from Walmart. I mean, Walmart's blackberries are very beautiful, right? But they don't have that taste. And I was in France not too long ago, and I saw all of these blackberries growing on a vine. And my first instinct, like a child, is to run over, and I wanted to pick them and start eating them. I wanted that taste again, and the people were like, no, you can't do that because of all the car fumes that are coming on them now. I never had to worry about that as a child. I was so tempted, but I had to control myself. So when I did this piece, and again, part of my process is manipulating my fabrics, dyeing them, staining them, cutting them up, borrowing from old vintage fabrics and cloth. I took those blackberries from Walmart and I wove them and I dyed that shirt. So they did have a purpose. And then I also did embroidered blackberries that are on her top. But the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. It has a double meaning there. And you know, in the South, it was customary to greet your neighbors with a pie. And so I have this character, my sister also, reaching out, advertising the blackberries, but she also has that hand and that side eye that's kind of like, I know who you are, I know what you're about, I'm confident in myself, and if my sister could have been here this evening, you would be able to point her out. Seriously, because she still has that attitude. And she would not be happy that I am sharing this story. After this, she would say, why do you always have to bring up my name? But she loves this blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. But also that blackberry, the sweeter the juice, also has to do with racial bias, skin tone, and how there is a way that, just like in my quilts, I can take my story and I can make it my own. I can elevate it and take it into a whole nother world. And the graphite, the black and white allows me to do that. And also my stories. So I love to add that bit of confidence, that bit of swagger, even with the underlying stories of racism that might be there. And again, very vintage fabrics that I use. My grandmother, she taught me that the smallest piece of fabric can hold generations of stories. She never let a piece of fabric go to waste. I mean, she would take that old dining room table, and make a fabric out of it. This is a vintage piece of tablecloth that I found. We would have tablecloths that served generations back on the quilts. And so these are very vintage as well. I use a lot of the patchwork style in my quilts because that was the style my grandmother would use. And it has like no particular pattern. It meanders all over the place. That is a style, when I studied textiles, that I realized goes all the way back to Africa. And Robert Ferris wrote a book about the flash of the spirit, and it talks about how you can see different traits in quilts today that were in cloths and textiles in Africa centuries ago. But it is said that that patchwork, how it moves about, it keeps evil spirits out. Now, I don't know if I believe that, but I never take any chances. So I always use that patchwork that goes all over the place. And the red shoes again that you can see. I also did embroidery on her pants. Her pants are not indigo dyed. That's just really very dark blue fabric. But the shirt, it does have indigo dye in it. And the ruff, that's like the old English style of royalty, being a queen. So all of that adds to that quilt, giving that person another level of character and persona. And this one here, this quilt is Eliza and Aggie. Again, calling out those names. And when I looked up Jeremiah Blaylock initially, when I looked up his will, it just named ages, and but it did not say anything about names. As I kept researching, I found the list of every name in his will. I don't know how that came about, but some of the names are the same names over and over again. Now, Eliza is short for Elizabeth, and my sister Elizabeth posed for me because Eliza was like in the early 1800s on the plantation. And when Jeremiah passed away and passed on his slaves to his children, some of them placed them back on auction blocks. And Eliza was 70 years old, placed back on the auction block. Yeah, so I'm like, what do you do with a slave that age? How do you work them? And sometimes if they had a special skill, sewing, cooking, they might use them for that. They may use them to raise children. But what I found is that Eliza did not have a price on her. She had a young boy with her, and they sold her 2 for 1. Oh, and yet she still has, like, you know, that stance that she knows who she is. She still has that willpower. And I did a lot of indigo dyeing as well with this, up in this area as well. I started indigo dyeing my ticking fabric. I still use a lot of it. The blocks that you see here are also symbols. This is like a 1930s quilt, it could be older. Like I said, people donate them to me. I find them at flea shops. But that red in the center is like, this symbol would say there's a safe house for you. And people would be there to welcome you and give you food and clothing and prepare you for your next travel. So this is what I mean about the hidden codes and secrets in quilts. And that is really nothing new, because ladies, since the beginning of time, even with crocheting and knitting, used to hide secret codes into their crochet work. But Aggie here was on the plantation, I mean, could have been in the mid-1700s. But for the life of me, when I saw that name, no one in my family registered to me. I didn't know how I was gonna render that person. And then I had a dream. And an owl was letting me pet it, a barn owl. And that's how I could see that hard shape in the face. And so I saw it as a reincarnated relative, and I put that there with Aggie. I don't know if that was the child that they put on the auction block with her. They did have a price on the child's, for the sale of the child, but yes, Aggie, Eliza was free. And again, the patchwork, the vintage patchwork. That's 1930s. Those are original flour sacks once they took the logos out and began to just make them in patterns. And this quilt here, which is, I did a series of works. So ladies, didn't have to, but I'll talk. I did a series of quilts that had to do with playing with the dolls. That's all I used to do. I think that's where my imagination started, when I would play with my dolls, and I could play with them for hours. But research has shown the value of playing with dolls, that for boys as well as girls, that it helps to build character, independence, and it helps you to have empathy for others. And my doll here is like missing an eye. Some of my most tattered dolls were my most cherished dolls. But doll play also has a lot to do with embracing your individuality and accepting diversity. I still love dolls even when I was shamed into putting them away. I noticed all my other friends were like moving away from dolls, and I was still loving my dolls. And seriously, when my mother's friends and my father's friends would come over, I would hide my dolls because my sisters told me that, I was getting too big for dolls. I started cutting out the paper dolls on the back of cereal boxes. I could not give up my dolls. And then when I started kind of making my own dolls, people saw that as another level of doll playing, and that's how I could start doing like making clothes and my own three-dimensional dolls and all. But that pattern in the back again, that's a vintage quilt, 1930s. There's sunflowers. And I didn't put the red shoes on, but I put the red socks on. And then I did a lot of French knots. I love hand stitching, but I don't always have time for hand stitching. And I'm still using a domestic sewing machine, believe it or not. These large things, I throw them over my shoulder and feed them through, but I think I'm getting ready to try doing a long arm. It's time for a long arm. Do you have any other questions for me?
Who is she? Who is she?
And that is me, playing with my dolls. And yeah, I believe that's where my imagination got started. I would play in closets. I would just be in my world. Mm-hmm. And so now I get to play without.
I'm very intrigued about your hands in all of these.
My hands?
The choices you made
Yes.
of the position of the hands.
Yes. And so they're holding on to each other in hopes they can go with each other, but that was very rare. My great-great-grandmother, Mariah, that was born in 1826, and her twin, Minerva, 1826, when they split up, my grandmother was able to stay on the Blaylock plantation. But Minerva, her twin, she was sold about 5 times, even before she reached the age of 8 years old. But I was able to track her down, her gravesite. And when I went to her gravesite, it was all these little rocks. They don't have real tombstones with the names on them. The church is now putting the names in the tombstones, the headstones. But Mariah had a little rock to indicate her, and there were nothing but these little stones all around. And I was told whenever I visited graveyards that not to step on graves, right? But there were so many in this graveyard, I'm going like, excuse me, excuse me. And there's also, further back in the woods, there were stones everywhere. And I was told those little stones, markings, that it was also safe for the slaves because you were not supposed to be able to read or write. And if they see you could put your relative's name on that headstone or that rock or anything, then, you know, you could really get in trouble for that. But also the ground, that it was Minerva, that was sold many times. She was in an actual graveyard site. That was my first time going there and doing reverence. And the ground was so soft. And like my sister Carolyn that I told you about, she was walking with her cane, and her cane was like going that deep into the ground. And our feet, it kept sinking into the ground. We were trying to stay brave, right? Because we really wanted to see where all the other markings were. But yeah, they were separated around 8 years old, and Minerva just was sold to several people. And I have ledgers of her bill of sales. One lady, Fulton, the first one I think she was sold to, it was $200. And so she was very young, and that's probably where that price came from. But yeah, the hands holding on together, trying to avoid that separation. So as I said before, when I'm creating my work, I can interject my own stories and I can uplift them and tell them like I would want them to be. Oh yes,
Do you like stretch a canvas on the wall and then draw the full figures and sort of plan it out like how it's going to go in the beginning, or do you work more like a collage artist?
You know, I made a huge quilt board in my studio, and it's made of a certain kind of fabric that will hold things on. I still pin just the canvas, and then I go to work. And one thing I discovered with the graphite, with moving my hands really large, while I'm working really large with graphite, another language comes through, and I'm able to like communicate on another level. But yeah, it's just canvas unprimed, and I just pin it to my quilt board, and I go to town. But that's a good question of stretching the canvas. I really don't do that. And then I use layers and layers of tracing paper, and that's when I begin to lay out, okay, this is how I want them to look. And then I can change up the tracing paper as I go along. Yes.
You have the eyes so evocative, every one. It's amazing. But everyone there is holding books except the one young lady, second from the right. What is she holding in her right hand? Back
Right here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a pencil. And people do say, well, I notice that a lot of your images, they're looking right at you. And yes, it's like an evocation of solidarity, as if to say, I see you, so I know you see me. And there was a time period during Jim Crow when my ancestors weren't allowed to look you in the eye. But this thing of wanting to be recognized with the names that came to me, that eye contact was also there, that importance.
This is what got to us as we looked at it, especially with her and with her, but look at her hands, her expression. We're trying to put ourselves there to, what is she thinking?
Yeah,
You can put all kinds of
all kinds of,
interpretations into it.
absolutely. And see, this is what gets me emotionally,
Yeah.
you know, when I'm working. And these positions, I can't always explain everything. I can't articulate sometimes everything that's coming through. But I never felt sorry for her that she was 70 years old and placed on an auction block. I think that was something she wanted me not to feel, and to portray her as, yeah, I've got the strength, I can get through this. Yeah, I can make this,
You're
and
not
so
about
can
to
you.
take me in.
Yeah.
You're not about to get your
Yeah.
hands on me.
Yes, yes. Is there symbolism to Elizabeth's turned-up collar?
Yeah.
Just to kind of like give more movement to her, letting you know that she's moving on, that there's, that she's not stationary, and that thing of never really knowing how long you're gonna be in one place. Is something I think also kind of communicated to me. I feel like I inherited a lot of those emotions that they went through. Definitely with the separation, I didn't really realize that until it came to me through my own sister. And then I could feel that pain that took place with these two sisters. So I think sometimes in our families, trauma that we experience, it gets passed on, and we may not know why it's there all the time. That's why I encourage people to really kind of investigate their family history. If you know where your family started, that's where the history is. We didn't move around a lot.
Do you think knowing our actual personal narrative and our family history?
I'm sorry, Justin, I didn't hear that.
Do you think knowing our personal narratives and our family history would help us create artwork in a different way, or?
Yeah, I do think so, because we are still individuals ourselves, right? So no matter how much we're researching, communicating, or listening to the different, it's impossible not to have us as part of that story. And that's what my signature with the graphite drawings and everything, that's part of my story. But it's still just connected to my ancestors. This Elizabeth quilt, I have these like stitches that I hand stitched on, and they're red and they're moving around and connected. And those that sew know that eventually you're gonna prick your finger and your blood is gonna get on your quilt. I used to hate that, but now I feel like it's my DNA, you know, connecting. And so I love stains in every kind of form. I love tears, rips, all of that. It's just like, it's a part of the story that gives it character. So yeah, that winds itself on around up to Aggie and on up into her different spaces. Also, the hand stitching, it's a running stitch. I created a bit of a scarification throughout her neck, her voice. That throat is very important. and that, she does have a voice, she does have a say. It may not be what plantation you're going to next, but your whole inner being, your personality, how you perceive your circumstances the same as it is with us, you have a say-so with that. Yes.
I just want to say, with all the stories and the research, some of it, like, is really painful. Do you ever have to walk away from
Too.
a piece of work?
And sometimes it can take weeks and days. When I found the research on my grandmother Cassie, and I found a book, because they did start out in Charleston, and she was listed as the only Black in 1835 that owned a slave. That took me back. I couldn't understand it, I couldn't comprehend it, never heard such a thing. And I mean, I had to take to the bed. And then, when I did my research, I found out the slave she owned, Dickie Meacham, was my actual great-great-great-great-grandfather, Cassie's husband. And the law then dictated that Cassie was considered a mulatto. She was mixed. How she was free, I do not know. I'm still researching. But she couldn't marry her husband, Dickie. He was a slave. And she was a mulatto. You were not allowed to marry. But in order to keep him in the household, she had to list him as her slave. But that, I did not know how to handle that. And also, I'm gonna share this. Even Jeremiah Blaylock, the Whistenots who they married into, for the most part, they kept my family together. That's how I'm able to really get to the nitty-gritty of my research. Yeah. Minerva, the other twin, while they separated her, I can't tell you, but most of them stayed together. But yes, my grandmother, a lot of my relatives that you see here, they had Blaylock, Whistenock, Smith written on their documents. They would have all three names because of how they were sold in marriage and all. Any other questions? Well, I just want to thank you so very much for coming out and listening to us.